I'm very happy to be here with Jonathan Safran Foer, who is one of the more important literary figures of our time. His debut novel, Everything is Illuminated, in 2002, I believe, was one of the more important novels of these last years. It was translated all over the world. But in these last years, Jonathan also wrote several essays. And his last essay, which in Italian it's called Possiamo salvare il mondo prima di cena perché il clima siamo noi, which is we are the weather, saving the planet begins at breakfast. It's an essay, and it deals with the issue of global warming in some ways and the climate change. The first thing I would like to ask you is, when did you become aware that this was the big issue of our time, and when you decided to go into action, to do something about that?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I know we both would have preferred to meet in Milan. I have to say, I have found myself missing Italy very much recently. This last week, I read Little Virtues by Natalia Ginsburg.
Yeah.
And I watched 8.5 last night, actually. And the combination of those two has made me miss Italy very much. And of all the places in the world, it's the one I'm most looking forward to going back to visit as soon as we are able. And so hopefully you and I can have a conversation next time.
And I hope you will come to Book City in a live event.
I would like nothing more, I can tell you. As for when I became aware of climate change, I don't think there was a moment. It was a kind of a creep of information over time. It became more and more difficult to ignore. And I should say, it wasn't an event, it was a process that is still ongoing. I am still, of course, I am aware of human-caused climate change. I am aware of what is at stake, but I can pretty much guarantee that in 5 years, I will look back at who I am right now and say, I really wasn't aware. The awareness grows as our knowledge of what's happening increases, and as the cultural conversation expands, which is why it's so important to have conversations like this, interactions like this. Everybody who's watching this knows that climate change is happening. I highly doubt that there's a single person watching this who has any doubt about the science. And yet, each of us, including me and including you, need to become more and more aware. Not necessarily in the sense of information, but in the sense of believing the information, believing it in a way that would motivate us to respond accordingly. To know that the planet is in danger and to know that the future is in danger, an appropriate response isn't simply to nod our heads, and it isn't even just to go to the occasional march. The appropriate response to a catastrophe of that scale is to devote our lives to fixing it. I don't mean that we all have to become activists, but we do need to, each of us, do as much as we can, which will be different for each of us.
At the beginning of your book, you tell a very interesting historical episode about a Polish man who is called Jankowski, who knew what was happening to the Jews in Poland. He entered concentration camps. He managed to get away from there, went to the United States, finally met a judge of the Supreme Court called Felix Frankfurter. He told the story, everything that he knew, and the judge, Mr. Frankfurter, answered him, "Oh, I don't believe you're a liar. I think that you're not a liar, but I can't believe this." And I feel this is the feeling that you're working against in these moments.
Absolutely, and I think there's an interesting detail that is worth mentioning, which is that Jankowski was Catholic. He was not Jewish, but he smuggled himself into the Warsaw Ghetto and into an extermination camp because of, you could say, empathy. It was not his own people who were being killed. He traveled to America and had this famous meeting with Felix Frankfurter, who, it's worth mentioning, was Jewish. And he couldn't believe, he acknowledged the truthfulness of what Karski was saying, but what he said, and it's very poetic the way he puts it, he said, my mind and my heart were not built in such a way that I am capable of believing it. And I do think that we are coming up against this problem with climate change, the ways that our minds and hearts were built. I don't think it's simply a question of having enough information, and I don't think it's a question of being good people or being bad people. There's something about the way that we were made evolutionarily that makes it extraordinarily difficult for most people, not for everybody, but for most people, and I would include myself among that most people, makes it extraordinarily difficult to believe in our hearts what we know in our minds. So I have absolutely no doubt about what the scientists are telling me. And when I say the scientists, I mean 96% of climate scientists. And yet, I feel very comfortable, I feel very at home, I feel very self-righteous when I get angry at people who deny what the scientists are saying. As it turns out, there are very, very few people like that anymore. Even in America, even in the Republican Party, the majority of Republicans have said they wish the United States remained in the Paris Climate Accords. So even though I feel comfortable being frustrated with or angry with science deniers, I have to acknowledge that my carbon footprint is almost certainly greater than that of the average science denier. So the question is, what matters? Does it matter what we know in our heads? Does it matter how we describe ourselves to ourselves and to others? Does it matter what our feelings are? Or does it matter what we do? So if we take the Earth's perspective, as if the planet could have a perspective, I don't think the planet cares what we know. And I don't think the planet cares what we feel. The planet cares what we do. And so my book, We Are the Weather, it's not really an argument that I'm making. It's not as if I achieved some kind of enlightenment and wanted to share it. Rather, I was aware of a struggle inside of myself between what it is that I know in my head and what it is that I do. And I felt sure that other people were experiencing the same struggle. And I wanted to try to give language to what that struggle is and how to potentially overcome it.
One part of your book is a dialogue between two voices. Who are these two voices? Which part of you is each of these two characters?
So in the book, I describe it as an argument between a person and his soul. I don't probably believe in the soul, to be honest, or at least not in the way that it's usually talked about. I tend not to believe in things that are outside of science and outside of scientific explanation. But I do believe that there are different parts of me inside of myself. There is a rational part of me, a philosophical part of me. There is a hedonistic part of me. There is a selfish part of me. There's a generous part of me. And the thing that I call the soul in the book is the part of me that knows what's right and what's wrong. I don't necessarily mean that in a global way, but in a very personal way. I find techniques, I have many techniques for ignoring that part of me, for distracting myself from listening to that part of me. But it's always there. And sometimes it's so subtle that I can't hear it at all. And sometimes, like on birthdays, for example, or on my children's birthdays, or on New Year's Eve, or as is happening right now, when the leaves are starting to turn yellow and red, there are moments when that part of me, that center that knows what's right and knows what's wrong, is awakened and becomes difficult to ignore. So I wanted to, in the book, give a kind of expression to this argument between the part of me that knows what it is that needs to be done in order to save the planet on the individual level, and the part of me that, despite knowing it, finds ways to ignore it or pretend that it isn't really happening.
In the book, you say that we make lots of actions, or we think lots of things that make us feel better, feel less guilty, but are useless if the real problem is the global warming. Can you give us some examples of useless behaviors, of useless actions?
So this extends far beyond just global warming. You know, a very simple example that's in front of us every day in America is our response to Trump. So people who are not his supporters really hate him and expend an awful lot of energy, emotional energy, hating him, as if hating him mattered, as if that were a political act. It's not a political act, it's an emotional act. People like me enjoy watching television programs that point out how ignorant Trump is, point out how evil he is. And we watch these things and they make us feel great. And it's easy to confuse watching them and nodding one's head for doing something politically. And Trump is very happy to have us watch them and nod our heads and not do anything at all. In the case of climate change, it's not that some of our acts are useless. It's that they're not as important as we think. So recycling, for example, or driving a hybrid car, or using LED light bulbs instead of traditional light bulbs. These things are important and we do need to do them, but they are not nearly as important as other activities. So science tells us there are 4 activities that matter more than all others, considerably more, and they are flying in planes, owning a car at all, eating, and overpopulation, having children. And we need to find ways not to stop doing those things. We don't have to suddenly become different people, but we do have to do those things with a kind of moderation that we're not used to. And it's by the way, a kind of moderation that our grandparents were used to. The future does not have to resemble a radically different world. It has to resemble the past in order to save the planet. We need to eat more like our parents ate and our grandparents. We need to travel more like our parents and grandparents traveled. We need to rein in the kind of overconsumption that is itself radical and new.
Why is eating food so important? Why is intensive farming so dangerous for the planet?
So it's important to say that this isn't my opinion. This is science as it's understood. The United Nations has said, the United Nations is not an animal welfare organization and it's not an environmental organization. The United Nations has said in a report that they issued called Livestock's Long Shadow, that animal agriculture is one of the top 2 or 3 causes of every significant environmental problem on the planet, both locally and globally. Air pollution, water pollution, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and greenhouse gas emissions. The IPCC, which is the gold standard for climate science right now, has said that even if we do everything else that we're talking about with regard to fossil fuels, we have no hope of meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Accords unless we also change how we eat. So animal agriculture is either the leading cause or the second leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions. Some estimates, the very, very low and conservative estimate says that animal agriculture is responsible for 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. The high estimate puts it just over 50%. And it's a catastrophic problem in a number of different ways. animals produce huge amounts of methane, and animal agriculture is the leading source of methane and nitrous oxide, which are two of the most powerful greenhouse gases. Methane is 86 times as powerful as carbon. Nitrous oxide is 310 times as powerful. Meat is an enormously inefficient food. We have to put between 6 and 26 calories into an animal to get 1 calorie out. And animals take up a huge amount of space. It is 91% of the deforestation of the Amazon is for the purpose of creating land for animals to graze or creating land to raise soy to feed to the animals. So we have, on the one hand, a system that is producing huge amounts of greenhouse gases and at the same time is requiring deforestation, which eliminates the trees which are absorbing the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. So it's a huge, huge problem. It's also one problem among many. It would be naive to say, this is what's causing global warming. That's not true. We can't save the planet simply by eating differently, but we can't save the planet without eating differently.
You spoke of an estimate going from 15 to 51%. It's quite a wide range. So how is it that science is not more precise on that?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is because the systems are just so complex. But the primary reason is it depends on what you include in your calculation. So if we're talking about how much greenhouse gas animal agriculture produces, is it correct to include the amount of greenhouse gas that would have been absorbed by the trees that are being demolished in order to create more farming? If we didn't eat meat, those trees would still exist. The meat industry demands the destruction of forests. But other people might say, well, that's not really fair because the animals aren't producing the gas that would have been absorbed by the tree. So there are perfectly reasonable and understandable explanations for why the difference is so extreme, but it's worth asking, does it really matter? Does it matter if it's 15% or 50%? Just to return to that Jan Karski story, when Karski went and had a meeting with Felix Frankfurter asked him a series of questions. How are Jews exterminated in the extermination camps? And is it possible to escape? And what do they eat? And in the Warsaw Ghetto, you say that there's a wall that separates the Jews from the rest of the city. How tall is the wall? So if Karski had said the wall is 15 feet high, or if he had said it's 50 feet high, those are very different walls. On the other hand, does it really matter? You can't get over a 15-foot wall. You can't get over a 51-foot wall. We know that animal agriculture is destructive on a scale that we cannot solve the problem of climate change without solving the problem of animal agriculture.
And so another question comes out, what can we do? What can you do? What did you do in your life, in your behavior to help jump over this wall?
So there are 4 things that we can do that matter most. There are many, many things we could do. But in terms of our daily choices, the 4 most important things are flying as little as possible. And COVID has taught us that it is possible to conduct business. It is possible to be happy without flying all the time. It may not be what we prefer, but we have a situation where we can't always get what we prefer. Driving less, driving as little as possible, using public transportation as much as possible, doing car sharing as much as possible, carpooling, and driving electric cars as much as possible when we have to drive. We need to control overpopulation. We have too many people, and we are expanding our population at too great a rate. The human population is always getting bigger, but planet Earth is not getting bigger. So our already finite resources are being stressed. and eating fewer animal products. So as I said before, it's not the case that we need to stop doing these things. You don't need to stop flying. You don't need to stop having children. And you don't need to stop eating animal products. We do need to do these things less. And is it awkward to do it less? For most people, it is. Is it an effort? It is. And I think most people would say some sacrifice is involved. But when we compare that sacrifice to the kind of sacrifice we're going to face and our children will face if we don't make these changes now, if we are capable of imagining ourselves into the future and looking back at this moment, it becomes so obvious, so clear what it is that we need to do.
Is it a sacrifice for you not eating meat, for instance?
It is a sacrifice, yes. It's funny, in many ways, I'm the worst spokesperson for this. I wish I could say, oh, it's very easy. Of course, it's the right thing to do. What's the big deal? It's just a meal. I happen to love food, and I happen to love the taste of meat. And a lot of my happiest memories actually involve meat, whether it was food that was prepared for me by my grandmother or by my father, or ways that I would celebrate, with friends. Very, very often it involved meat. And when I think to some of my best meals that I've had in my life, a lot of them involve meat. So, I have been thinking about these issues since I was a child. And I've been writing about them for more than 10 years. And I still find it very difficult. And I would say I find it difficult pretty much every single day. I do. I wish that it were just an event. I wish I could make the decision, based on what I know about the world and what my values are, and never look back. But that's not the way it's going to be for me. I assume that I will spend the rest of my life struggling with this. But first of all, it's a very manageable struggle. It's not as if I'm suffering or anything. I just sometimes want to eat something that I won't eat. And secondly, it's a struggle that makes me proud and that brings me a kind of gratification and a kind of happiness that I think is larger than the pleasure of a meal. It's not as immediate as the pleasure of a meal. It's not as primitive as the pleasure of eating great food, but it is a pleasure and it's sustainable. When you think about the best meal you ever had, right? I'll think about the best steak I ever had. It was really good. But my pleasure ended as soon as I had swallowed the last bite. It doesn't last. If you want to have more food pleasure, you need to eat more food. Saying no to something that you want because of a value that you care about also offers a pleasure, and that's a pleasure that extends beyond the moment that you make it. It is a pleasure. It makes one happy to be the person that you want to be, to live a life that is thoughtful and careful, and by your own definition, not by somebody else's definition, but by your own definition, a life that is good.
What you ask for is a big change. It's a big change in the lives of the individuals, and it's a big change in politics, in the vision we have of our society. In the book, you talk about the polio vaccine, and at a certain moment, there's a discussion. We stopped polio. It was because of Salk and Sabin, who made up the vaccine. It was because of Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, who made political decisions on that. It was because of Elvis Presley, who made a picture having his vaccine. What do we have to do to make this change in our lives in the direction you're talking about?
So to begin, you said something like, you're asking for a big change. I'm not asking for anything. I'm sharing the information of what the planet is asking for. I say that because it's really very important that we keep coming back to the fact that these aren't anybody's opinions, and it's not anybody's argument. It is science as we understand it. And science tells us that unless we do less of certain activities, we will destroy the planet. And we are in the process of destroying the planet because of the amount of these activities that we do. In terms of how to bring about change, I use polio as an example because it happened both from the top down, the government funding research, scientists conducting research, celebrities influencing thousands and millions of people to take a vaccine, but it also happened from the bottom up, on an individual level, individuals volunteering to be in test trials for the vaccine, and ultimately, of course, individuals agreeing to take the vaccine. So similarly, the kind of change that's required to save the planet has to be bottom up. It has to involve individuals changing their daily habits, and it has to also be top down. We need governments to legislate for change, and we need corporations to behave differently. We are in a moment right now where there are a lot of reasons to believe in the individual. The trends suggest that people are becoming more and more conscious of climate change and more desiring to be a part of the solution rather than the problem. This is especially true if you look at college campuses. In America right now, there are more vegetarians in college than there are Catholics. It's a startling statistic if you think about it. Between the ages of 25 and 35 in America, a quarter of those people identify as vegetarians. It's a huge number, absolutely huge. And the younger you look, the younger the age, the more likely a person is to eat a little differently, to fly a little differently, to drive differently. The problem is right now, we don't have a lot of action from the top down. We don't have leaders who are doing what needs to be done to change systems. In the United States, of course, we have a tragic situation where a president calls climate change a hoax. We have to note, though, that does not make him a representative of the Republican Party. The majority of the Republican Party has actually said they want to remain in the Paris Climate Accords. So it puts him far outside of the mainstream in terms of belief in science and a will to respond to science. But it's a tragic problem that we have, which hopefully will be corrected soon.
You were talking of a bottom-up movement, and what you've seen in the last years with Greta Thunberg is a kind of movement that comes from young people and from bottom-up. What do you think of what's happening from in this perspective?
Well, there are reasons to be very hopeful. I think there's also a danger in that hope itself. Making us feel complacent or making us feel safe in a way that we shouldn't. You often hear people my age or older saying, isn't it so great to watch young people take the lead? Well, it is and it isn't. It's great to see them activated and mobilized, but they can't do it alone. They have no political power or very, very little. They're incapable of voting. And they're not yet in charge of their own finances for the most part. So there's a temptation sometimes to feel like, oof, well, thank goodness for Greta Thunberg and the rest of them. They're going to solve the problem for us, so we don't need to try as hard. Instead, I think a better response is, because of how they are mobilizing, we should feel a responsibility to do even more. Because they are now our, witnesses of our inaction.
There's a kind of paradox because they are young people, and you said we have to look back, we have to live a little bit like our grandparents used to live. So how can young people think of a future that comes from the past?
Well, they need, it's a coincidence rather than a destination. It's not that we need to look at the habits of our grandparents and imitate them. It's that we need to fly less, we need to drive less, we need to eat less meat. As it turns out, when we do those things, it will resemble human behavior for thousands of years. So it is simultaneously revolutionary and conservative. It is at the same time futuristic and old-fashioned.
I have some questions about you as a writer. You began writing novels, and you were very successful in that. And at a certain moment, you began writing essays. What's the relationship between the novelist and the essayist?
Well, I can only speak for myself, of course. There's an old saying, or maybe it's a joke, that once upon a time there was a man whose life was so good there's no story to tell about it. And the stories are always born out of a problem or discomfort or conflict, something that doesn't have resolution. And I have written both my novels and my nonfiction from that starting point. The difference is, with a novel, I'm not able to articulate what the problem is. It's just something that I feel or I intuit. And a novel is an effort not to solve a problem, but to articulate a problem. In the case of nonfiction, I know, of course, what it is that the problem is and what I'm writing about. It's not as intuitive. It's not as organic, you could say. It's very deliberate. But in both cases, they are about something that was upset inside of me, lacking rest or resolution or peace. And a book, writing is for me the best way that I know to try to take a discomfort and move it toward resolution. A book creates a context for thinking about things in a very deliberate and slow and sensitive way that normal everyday life doesn't allow for. It also creates a context for feeling things more deeply than everyday life allows for. And that's true whether you're a writer or a reader.
But I believe that working on a nonfiction book, you have to do lots of research. How do you manage this kind of work?
So in the case of this most recent book, We Are the Weather, it actually didn't involve a ton of research, or rather all of the research can be done online. We live in a historical moment when the science of climate change is very widely accessible. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of scientific papers that anybody who cares to read them can find for free and immediately. That's quite different than my first book, Eating Animals, which did require a lot of research and was very difficult because, unlike climate science, information about animal agriculture is concealed. It's kept like a secret, as if they were the military industry. So even having access to the kinds of farms that produce 99.9% of the meat in America required me to go in the middle of the night because and to break the law, because otherwise there's no way to simply see where your food comes from.
But you have an impressive bibliography in this book too, anyway.
So yeah, but that's only a matter of reading. You know, I didn't have to do the work. I only had
the detective work.
Yeah. There are thankfully many brilliant people now, scientists, working on both figuring out what's going on with the planet, which is always changing, and making sure that the public knows about it.
And how can you transform all this information in a book that people like to read, want to read?
Well, I don't know if I did. It's and believe me, we could find somebody who said I didn't. I whenever I write, whether it's a novel or nonfiction, I am my own reader. It's like we're not with books. There's nothing objective that we're referring to. It's not as if a book is funny or not funny. It's just funny to some people and it's not funny to others. So if I'm writing a joke in a book, I don't call up 100 people I know and take a vote. I always have to fall back on my own sense, of whether something is funny, whether something is interesting, whether something is emotionally persuasive, whether something matters. So I had the experience of reading quite a lot about climate change, and a lot of it moved me, but none of it moved me in a way that was sustainable. I would become very upset for 10 minutes, and then I would get back to life and stop thinking about it. The trick is not to be interesting, but to be sticky, to not to make an impression on somebody, but to make a lasting impression on somebody. And so I was very sensitive to that as I was writing. And I used all of the tools I could think of to try to make the book sticky, which included some amount of humor, it included some amount of storytelling. It included being both personal, but also objective about science. Each chapter kind of takes its own form in the book. That is both because I wanted the book to be an honest reflection of my own thought process. It's a word that I notice has come up a lot in our conversation, process. I wanted the book to reflect a process, but also I was thinking about the reader and how to maintain a reader's interest.
And the book begins with stories rooted in the past, coming also from the story of your family, and it ends with a letter to your children. How is your personal experience important in this book?
Well, it's a very personal book. It's not necessarily the book that I thought I was going to write. I actually thought I was going to write a little manifesto, 60 pages or something. But I realized that as good as that might feel to write, it wouldn't be honest, because I don't feel certainty. I feel doubt. I don't feel resolve. I feel a struggle. And I made a choice to be honest about that and to share my struggle. And that would require a personal book, and a personal book would require contextualizing my struggle inside of what's going on in my life. As it turns out, in the year that I wrote the book, my grandmother was dying. And so that becomes a kind of central feature in the book, and it gave me occasion to reflect on death, on loss, but also on survival and on the will to survive and what it means to do what is necessary to survive.
And if you look ahead in the future, what images do you see? What will happen in the next years?
I have no idea. I wish I knew. I think that what happens, the only thing this is going to sound like I'm not saying anything at all, but I think things are either going to get worse or get better. I don't think they're going to stay like this. I think we've reached a point at which we are going to, in essence, choose our own destruction or choose our own salvation. I don't know which we will choose.
And because it won't be just an individual choice, it will be the choice of mankind in some ways.
well, mankind is individuals. You know, it's 7 billion, 7.5 billion individuals. It's funny, I have this conversation with my younger son all the time. He'll say, why vote? I mean, it just doesn't matter. Why vote? You know, what we all know that the election will not come down to one vote, so why vote? And he's right, of course. You know, why do anything? Why eat differently? Why fly differently? Why not just enjoy what there is to be enjoyed and hope for systemic change, hope for change on the scale of mankind? And there are a lot of responses, but the one that I find most persuasive is that we don't do things alone, even when it seems like we're doing them alone. Each of us is a kind of a role model. We can't help but be. You know, we live in a historical moment when our choices are monitored as they never have been before. So if you, after this conversation, decide, I'm going to become a vegetarian, Amazon will know about it. Apple will know about it. Facebook will know about it. Google will know about it. Our choices are being tracked. That's almost always a bad thing. But in the sense of bringing about systemic change, we have more power as individuals than we have at any other moment in history. So we need to exercise that power.
Thank you very much, Jonathan Safran Foer. So we will try to save the planet beginning at breakfast, as in the original subtitle, or before dinner, as in the Italian edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.